What's up guys, it's me Jeremy. Playing off-meta champions can be one of the most fun ways to play League of Legends for a lot of people, and it can often work to your advantage too, since a lot of players are so used to playing against the meta that you'll have a serious surprise factor to your advantage. However, a lot of the time, the reason why a champion isn't meta is because, well, they just aren't that good, no matter how fun they might be to play. So here are a few non-meta champions that I think are stronger than a lot, if not most, of the current meta, at least for solo queue. To keep things consistent, we'll be using the statistic of a 3% play rate or less as the definition of what is a non-meta champion. Anything less than a 3% play rate is really small, and that's definitely the most consistent way to judge if a champion is off meta or not. As well, I've teamed up with ProGuides.com for the editing on this video. If you're interested in more traditional guides, they have a free trial that gets you full access, so you can check them out and decide for yourself if you like it or not. As well, here's some of my favorite comments where I asked what champions you wish would be easier to play. Today's question is, what off-meta champion do you think is god tier? Anyways, let's get started. Our first champion on the list is Trundle Jungle. Trundle Jungle's play rate is just a tiny bit above 1%, however he's been a really nice product of a lot of indirect buffs as a result of the meta. He's a fantastic counterpick to a ridiculous amount of jungle champions. Due to his Q lowering attack damage, he does a great job fighting Devourer and Warrior junglers, and his ultimate is great versus anyone building Cinderhulk. He might struggle a little bit versus a Runic Echoes jungler, but his dueling power is still really solid, and he really works as sort of a bruiser jungler that brings a lot of counter mechanics that really give you some nice tools. With his crowd control and stat reduction, he also brings some nice healthy clears, great ganks, and surprisingly high damage. The next champion on the list is Vel'Koz Mid. His play rate sits at about 1.75% at the moment, but he's actually been pretty solid for quite a while now. He plays a lot like Lux does, with super high range damage, but also some nice crowd control that lets you burst people down by unloading your combo on them. Compared to Lux, he has a little bit better wave clear, but a little bit less survivability since he doesn't have the shield. And although he might seem like a poor pick versus assassins, most assassins actually have a very specific pattern of where they jump to with their gap closers. For example, versus a Zed, if they ult you, you can just use your E behind you, and you guarantee it landing, and then you can punish them by landing more abilities to follow it up, and if you struggle with that, you can always take exhaust anyways. His burst and poke brings a lot to teamfights, and with incredibly high range on quite a few abilities, he also has some nice pick potential too. Next on the list, we have Kayle Top. Her play rate sits at just a tiny bit above 2%, and she's been a great option ever since the Season 6 changes. The new Ginsu's is great on her, and she does great in the meta right now by bringing an incredibly powerful tool to completely shut down an assassin, which is of course her ultimate. Her laning phase is also ridiculously strong, especially in top lane where you play against a lot of low range, kiteable bruisers and tanks, since she does kind of struggle a little bit versus poke mages. With her ultimate, you can tower dive people over and over again in lane, and her utility and damage in teamfights is just awesome. She's a great split pusher too, since her ultimate guarantees a 1v1 victory versus almost anyone, and she has solid wave clear. With her E, you can proc 3 stacks of the Fervor of Battle Keystone Mastery with one attack, since it counts as both an auto attack and a spell, so in lane the amount of sustained damage she can output right off the bat even from level 1 is pretty much just unmatched for a ranged champion. And since her passive shreds tank stats, she does great up in the top lane where champions can be easily kited by her utility. And at number 4 we have Zilean Support. He sits at a play rate of a little bit above 2%, and he's a benefactor of the meta quite similar to the way that Kayle is. His ultimate is an 80 carries wet dream in a teamfight versus anyone trying to kill them, but the real reason why Zilean shines is because of the utility and options that his E brings actually. When it's maxed out, it's a 99% targeted slow or a speed boost that lasts for 2.5 seconds, and by the time you get to teamfights with Rewind, you can cast it twice in under 5 seconds. But it also works incredibly well with a lot of junglers and bruisers who are trying to run in. Your top laners like Darius and Aurelia make amazing use of the speed boost, as could your jungler like Volibear or Udyr. His new passive is a little bit weird, but it's actually quite useful in the mid game to give a meaningful amount of experience at a time, and although his Q is his only damaging ability, it actually has one of the highest base damage scalings of any non-ultimate ability in the entire game, giving up to 70 base damage per rank at one point. And although the stun might be a little bit difficult to land, you can combo it with the slow or other crowd control from your allies, and it's certainly not difficult to land single individual bombs in lane for some nice harass. And in lane, once you hit level 6, it's super easy to win fights since it's just so hard to outplay his ultimate in a prolonged skirmish, and that goes the same for 3v3 or 4v4 fights with the rest of your team that are oh so common down at the bot lane. Next up, we have Twitch AD Carry. He sits at a play rate of just under 3%, but I've always really been a fan of Twitch. Stealth is a super powerful mechanic and allows you to pick up some kills that you would otherwise never be able to get on any other AD carry by stealthing in on someone and picking them off. Although some people might play around stealth such as Akali's or Vayne's reasonably well, Twitch's stealth is a lot more unpredictable and harder to see coming, especially if you're making use of it as an initiation to assassinate a target. He also has 2 inherent steroids in his kit, as well as area of effect damage, a slow, and a tiny bit of burst with expunge that wraps together to bring you a really awesome AD carry. Another great off-meta champion right now is Galio mid. He currently sits at a play rate of just above 0.5%, and it was kind of interesting to me when I realized how good he actually was. My initial thoughts on him were like, oh, it's an assassin meta, and Galio's kind of like an anti-mage champion, so he probably just sucks in this meta, right? Well, that's not actually entirely the case when you take a look at what his ultimate tries to do. Versus a mage champion like Lux, for example, Orianna, etc., they tend to have really high ranges, but also really good disengage. So actually walking up and getting in range to ult them is almost impossible unless you have flash up, and even then you're still open to being outplayed. However, versus an assassin like Talon or Zed, if they ever try to do anything to you, they put themselves in a position to be ulted by getting into melee range, in which case you can land the rest of your abilities as well as stopping their combo. And his base damage scaling is just so insane. His Q gets 55 damage per rank, and his E gets 45 damage per rank, that you can oftentimes just build full-on tank items if you want, and his W makes him really difficult to burst down with those extra tank stats, and he still does great versus mages because you can always just stack heavy magic resistance. In teamfights, landing your ultimate on 2 or 3 people is game changing, and when you have flash up, you can make some incredible plays. His wave clear is fantastic, which he can use to exploit versus a lot of matchups in lane, and his kill pressure is not that bad either. All you really need to do is land 1 or 2 abilities and then you can burst them down with a full combo with your ultimate. His ultimate's just such an insane tool, and the rest of his kit is so good that you really shouldn't overestimate how important it is to make use of his passive. It's nice to have, but it's really not needed at all since his base damage is already good enough that you actually have a lot more options in your build path than you might think. The biggest problem with Galio is just the cooldown of his ultimate is really long, and he does have a pretty heavy reliance on flash in teamfights, so you have to be careful not to misuse those crucial tools or you'll get punished pretty heavily, but other than that, he's a really awesome pick. And last but certainly not least, we have Skarner Jungle, who currently sits at a play rate of a quarter over 1%. Although he was hurt a tiny bit by the Frozen Fist nerf, it doesn't change how Skarner is an incredible jack-of-all-trades tank that brings solid ganks, decent damage, and the incredible tool of his ultimate. Whether you're using it to stop an assassin or flashing in to pick off a carry, his ultimate just puts in a ridiculous amount of work and gives him so much more playmaking potential than a lot of other junglers. And as long as you have those little points capped, his dueling in the jungle can be really solid, as are his clears, since he's never really going to be running out of mana. If you ever get in a fight in the jungle, his passive gives him such a ridiculous amount of attack speed, and with the mana it gives you so much more damage since you can just constantly spam his Q over and over again with a cooldown reset. His E is a great ability for ganks, of course, since it slows before proccing the stun, giving you time to get in range if you need it, and allows you to get multiple stuns off in teamfights. And with all of his cooldown resets, his damage is pretty nice, and he's super tanky with great crowd control. And his ultimate is just such an amazing tool that you can use to carry games, and it's not hard to see why Skarner's a great option. And that wraps up the list. If you enjoyed the video, hit that like button, and if you didn't, hit the dislike. Subscribe if you want. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.